When the hero was betrayed and the truth forgotten. The story of an invisible avenger who turned betrayal into precise revenge and forced the city to confront the consequences of its indifference. Yesterday his name was spoken in whispers of gratitude. Today it was thrown like a stone. The betrayed hero stood in the middle of the square and listened as the crowd reshaped the past into a convenient story. He remembered the night when fire swallowed the city and only he remained on the walls until dawn. Remembered the screams of those he saved and the hands reaching for him with hope. Yet now those same hands pointed at him. Someone had to be guilty, and he was perfect for the role. The truth turned out to be too complex for those who wanted simple answers. He stayed silent not because he was weak, but because he still believed justice had ears. Yet his words drowned in the noise of fear and profit. He realized that a savior is needed only until he becomes a reminder of someone else's cowardice. In that moment, something inside him broke, not loudly but forever. He recalled the words of Friedrich Nietzsche. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster, and felt the bitter irony because the monster had already been chosen without his consent. When he tried to speak, he was answered with silence because silence is more convenient than truth. In the shadow of the tower, he understood that explanations no longer mattered to anyone, and that people's memory is shorter than their fear. And then another line echoed in his mind, this time from Albert Camus. Injustice always finds accomplices among the indifferent. He looked at the city he had saved and that had now turned away, and for the first time allowed himself to think not about how to prove the truth, but about how to make them feel its price. In that silence, a new decision was being born, cold and precise. The betrayed hero took a step toward the darkness, and the darkness stepped back to accept him. Because when the truth is no longer needed, it becomes a weapon, and he already knew against whom he would raise it. By nightfall, his footsteps no longer echoed in the streets that once chanted his name. He moved through forgotten passages beneath the city where stone remembered more truth than people ever did. Every step stripped away the last threads of the man he used to be. He replayed the trial in his mind, not the words but the faces, the way judges avoided his eyes and witnesses repeated lies as if reading from a script. He understood then that the verdict had been written long before the hearing began. Guilt was not proven, it was assigned. The city needed a villain to seal its fear, and he fit the shape too well. In the dark, he whispered a bitter thought from George Orwell. In a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And he almost laughed because revolutions require listeners, and he had none. The truth had turned radioactive, something everyone feared to touch. He remembered how easily gratitude curdles into resentment when it reminds people of what they failed to do themselves. His sacrifice had become an accusation, his courage a mirror they shattered by blaming him. Deeper underground, he found the old maps, the ones never shown to the public, paths built for escape, not justice. There he began to plan, not in rage, but in clarity. He would not scream his innocence anymore. He would demonstrate their guilt. Another voice rose in his thoughts, this one colder and sharper: Hannah Arendt. The most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. He twisted the meaning into his own resolve, understanding that change terrifies those who benefit from stillness. The city would resist him not because he was wrong, but because he threatened comfort. As torches flared above and guards searched for a monster they believed already existed, he shaped himself into what they expected, not to confirm their lie, but to use it. If they wanted a villain, he would become one on his own terms, not chaotic, not blind, but deliberate. Justice had failed him, so he would replace it with consequence. And as dawn crept over the roofs, he finished his first list of names, not enemies, but collaborators, people who chose silence over truth. People who would soon learn that indifference has a cost. The hero was gone, and in his absence something far more patient had taken root. Morning arrived without forgiveness. The city woke as if nothing had happened, and that normality felt like the final insult. He watched from a high window as merchants opened stalls and children ran across stones washed clean of yesterday's judgment. It amazed him how easily people stepped over broken truth when it threatened routine. He began to understand the true architecture of injustice, not built by villains alone, but supported by habits and comfort. Every banner that once carried his symbol had been taken down, replaced by warnings and cautious slogans. Fear had been carefully taught overnight. He remembered how leaders spoke of unity while sharpening knives behind closed doors. how they praised him when he was useful and erased him the moment he became inconvenient. Power, he learned, does not hate heroes, it uses them until they start asking questions. A line surfaced in his mind from Machiavelli. The one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. And he saw its truth written on every obedient face below. The people did not want facts, they wanted relief from responsibility. He could have fled far beyond the walls, but exile would only prove their story right. Instead, he chose proximity, because consequences must be felt close to home. He studied schedules, routes, habits, the quiet skeleton of the city that no speech ever mentioned. This was not madness, it was preparation. Another thought followed, this time from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. The irony burned because he was the only one willing to face what they had buried. He no longer sought to be understood, only to be undeniable. His plan was not to destroy the city, but to force it to look at itself without filters or lies. Each step forward felt heavier yet clearer. The hero had once carried hope, now he carried memory, and memory is dangerous. As evening shadows stretched across the rooftops, he marked the first place where truth would surface, not as words, but as impact. And for the first time since the square, he smiled, not with joy, but with certainty. The city had chosen its myth, and he had chosen its awakening. Night folded itself around the city like a secret everyone pretended not to keep. He moved through it with the calm of someone who had already lost everything worth stealing. The first name on his list was not the most powerful, but the most visible. A council spokesman beloved for his soothing words and public grief. The man who cried loudest when blame was assigned and smiled widest when it stuck. Watching from across the street, he saw how performance replaced conscience, how carefully chosen phrases absolved crowds from thinking. He remembered standing beside this man after the fire, listening to promises about truth and accountability, promises that dissolved the moment they became inconvenient. Betrayal, he learned, rarely arrives with a knife, it comes with reassurance. A familiar voice echoed in his thoughts, this time Voltaire. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And suddenly the cheering crowd from the square made terrible sense. Lies had not merely protected the guilty, they had educated the innocent into cruelty. Timing mattered more than force, so he waited until the city was watching something else, until distraction did the work that darkness used to do. When the spokesman stepped onto his balcony to deliver another speech about unity, and moving forward, the lights failed one by one behind him. Silence rolled through the street, thick and uneasy. Then the screens across the square flickered alive, not with threats, but with records, dates, signatures, orders bearing his voice, his name, his choices. No accusation was spoken because evidence does not need shouting. Panic bloomed slowly, beautifully, as truth tends to do when denied too long. He felt no triumph, only balance. Another line surfaced in his mind from Marcus Aurelius. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. And he almost rejected it because he was becoming exactly what was required, not what was praised. As guards rushed and the crowd fractured into confusion and rage, he vanished before anyone could decide who to chase. By morning they would call it an attack, an act of terror, anything but a mirror. Yet something had shifted, a hairline crack in the certainty that had condemned him. The city had tasted doubt, and doubt once planted does not obey curfews. He retreated to the shadows, knowing this was only the beginning, not of chaos, but of exposure. The truth had finally stepped onto the stage, and it did not ask permission. Somewhere above him sirens wailed, and below him fear took root. And for the first time since his fall he slept without dreams, because purpose had replaced hope. The city did not wake in anger, but in denial. Officials called the night a fabrication, a trick, a foreign interference, anything that preserved the comfort of yesterday. He listened to the broadcast from a borrowed room, and noted how quickly truth is rebranded when it threatens order. The spokesman was removed quietly, not arrested, not questioned, just reassigned into silence. Accountability had been replaced with disappearance. People argued in markets and homes, choosing sides not based on facts, but on how much fear they could afford. He understood then that exposure alone was not enough, because systems heal themselves by sacrificing pawns. What mattered was pattern, not scandal. He began mapping connections like constellations drawn from lies, contracts, favors, shared guilt. Each line told a story the city refused to read. He recalled a thought from Michel Foucault. Power is everywhere not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere, and he saw it clearly now. Injustice was not a tower, it was a web. Cut one strand, and the rest tightened. Patience became his discipline because haste belonged to heroes, and heroes end up on statues or graves. He was neither anymore. At dusk he walked openly through a district where his name was still cursed, and felt the strange freedom of being already condemned. When nothing worse can happen, fear loses its grip. He watched people avert their eyes not out of hatred, but recognition. Some of them knew the truth and chose survival. Instead, that choice no longer enraged him, it instructed him. Another voice surfaced, calm and unforgiving this time, from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. He accepted that even his own heart was no exception. What he was doing would not cleanse him, it would define him. That night he prepared the next release, not aimed at leaders, but at institutions, banks, archives, charities, masks of virtue hiding rot. The goal was not collapse, but awakening, slow, unavoidable. As he sealed the files, he felt the final remnants of the man who once wanted applause dissolve. What remained was sharper, quieter. The city would learn in increments because truth forced too quickly breaks minds. Tomorrow another curtain would lift, and the audience would again pretend surprise. He lay back and stared at the ceiling, counting not victories but consequences. And for the first time he welcomed them all. The next morning arrived heavier, as if the air itself remembered what had been revealed. The city moved slower, eyes lingered on screens, headlines contradicted themselves within hours, and certainty began to rot from the edges. He watched clerks hesitate before unlocking doors and officials reread orders twice, as if words might change meaning when stared at long enough. Distrust had entered daily routine, and that was irreversible. He understood now that fear was no longer aimed at him, but inward, turned against structures once believed eternal. He walked among them unnoticed, because monsters are easier to hunt than doubts. Every step confirmed what he had learned: injustice collapses not with explosions, but with hesitation. He remembered a line by Václav Havel. The real test of moral integrity is not how one behaves in moments of comfort, but in moments of fear. And he saw the test unfolding everywhere and failing quietly. People chose safety over truth again, but the choice tasted bitter. Now, his next move was smaller, almost invisible: a single document released at the wrong time, a budget line that contradicted a speech, a signature that linked enemies as partners. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just undeniable. Another thought followed, sharp and unsentimental, from Franz Kafka. A cage went in search of a bird, and the city felt like that cage, frantic, confused, hunting for something to blame. Security tightened, checkpoints multiplied, yet no one knew what they were guarding against. He felt a strange calm, watching the system exhaust itself, chasing shadows, while the real damage spread through trust. Once trust fractures, authority becomes theater, and theater cannot command obedience for long. He did not celebrate. He observed because observation grants control. By evening, rumors outpaced official statements, and the word scapegoat surfaced in conversations, whispered then spoken aloud. Some began to say his name not with hatred, but uncertainty, and uncertainty was power. He knew redemption was still impossible. Stories once written rarely accept edits. But vengeance was evolving into something colder, a re-education through consequence. He was no longer correcting the record, he was altering the future. As night settled, he erased his trail and prepared to disappear again, not out of fear, but strategy. The city was learning to doubt, and doubt would do the work for him. He closed his eyes, knowing that from this point forward the system would destroy itself, trying to restore a past that no longer existed. By the seventh day, the city had split into layers of truth, each thinner than the last. Official statements floated on top, polished and hollow, while beneath them conversations grew sharper, more dangerous. He listened from cafes and transit lines, where people spoke freely until they noticed who was near. Fear had changed flavor. It was no longer about him, but about what else might be false. Monuments felt lighter now, as if history itself was unsure of its footing. He noticed how quickly loyalty erodes once certainty is gone. Allies watched one another too closely, and enemies pretended to cooperate. He understood that instability was not chaos, it was opportunity. He remembered a line from Sun Tzu: "In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity," and allowed himself a brief acknowledgement of its truth, because chaos was finally no longer his burden alone. His next move required no files, no screens, no revelations, only absence. He withdrew completely, letting the city argue with itself. Systems hate silence more than attacks because silence offers no target. Meetings multiplied, task forces formed, commissions announced investigations that investigated nothing. People waited for another strike, another disclosure, and in that waiting, trust continued to bleed out. He saw how leadership addicted to control cannot tolerate uncertainty and so overreaches. Another voice surfaced, this one dry and merciless, from Jean-Paul Sartre. Every existing thing is born, without reason prolongs itself out of weakness and dies by chance. He applied it not to life, but to power, recognizing how fragile authority becomes once its myth is questioned. Whispers of his innocence began to circulate, not loudly, not bravely, but persistently. Some tried to retract past accusations quietly, as if history could be edited without witnesses. He felt no satisfaction, only distance, because the time for vindication had passed with the verdict. What mattered now was direction, not reputation. By evening, protests formed not for him, but against unnamed corruption, a safer target that still carried his shadow. He watched from afar, knowing symbols matter more than individuals. His role was complete for this phase. He had become an absence that rearranged behavior. The hero they betrayed would never return, and the villain they invented was no longer useful. What remained was a city forced to confront itself without a scapegoat to absorb its guilt. And as night settled, he allowed himself one final clarity. This was no longer revenge, it was consequence unfolding naturally once the lie was removed, and consequences, unlike forgiveness, do not require agreement. Weeks passed, and the city began to breathe differently. Uneasily, like a body recovering from poison, the people moved carefully, their glances sharper, their words measured. Every conversation now carried the weight of doubt. The officials, once confident in scripted authority, faltered at every decision, and the courts, previously unquestioned, were treated with suspicion. He observed it all from the shadows of his hidden room. No one suspected that the man they had condemned was the quiet force remapping their habits. He recalled words from Niccolò Machiavelli. It is double pleasure to deceive the deceiver, and smiled at the subtlety of his revenge. He did not need chaos, only awareness, a constant unease that made the powerful rethink. The complacent second-guessed themselves. The commoners noticed that things were never quite as they seemed. He began releasing smaller truths, meticulously chosen, to spark tension without immediate danger. A ledger here, a memo there, each one illuminating corruption, complicity, or cowardice. People began to turn on each other quietly. Alliances crumbled under scrutiny and fear. He remembered another thought from Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And he understood that inaction had already ruled this city for too long. Now the city itself was forced into action, not because it wanted to be moral, but because it could no longer trust its own foundations. In cafes, marketplaces, government offices, he watched whispers form, subtle accusations spread, people unable to ignore what had been there all along. Slowly, methodically, the environment he had shaped turned into a pressure cooker, each small release of truth a match lighting unseen fuses, and yet he felt no malice, only precision. Justice in its rawest form. The city would suffer consequences, yes, but they were earned. Every panic, every misstep, every whisper carried the weight of decisions they themselves had made or ignored. He became less a man and more a catalyst, watching how the simplest truths, when denied long enough, can reshape the world. And as night fell again, he allowed himself to feel not triumph, but inevitability. The betrayed hero had disappeared, and in his place the reckoning had quietly begun. By now the city was a network of tension and suspicion, every decision measured against the knowledge that nothing was as it seemed. He moved like a ghost through streets that remembered him only as a villain. Though his presence was unseen, his influence was everywhere, subtle, insidious. He planted documents, leaked communications, exposed minor scandals that revealed major truths, and each revelation spread through offices, cafes, and homes, like threads of fire creeping into dry wood. The people grew restless, the officials defensive, the public uneasy. He watched it unfold with the patience of someone who had learned that time is an ally of consequence. He recalled the words of Thomas Paine: "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigue of supporting it," and understood that the fatigue of facing truth was precisely what would change them. Another thought surfaced from Sun Tzu: "Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak." And he realized how perfectly it described his method. He was absent but omnipresent, powerless in appearance but shaping every action, every hesitation, every argument. Each step in his plan built upon quiet chaos. He began to map the alliances that had condemned him, showing them to each other in small, undeniable ways. Whispers grew into arguments, and arguments into mistrust. Nobody knew who to trust, not even those at the top. He observed people beginning to take action, not inspired by morality, but by fear of exposure. The seeds of accountability grew in cracks that only patience had opened, and yet he felt no pleasure in destruction, only precision in alignment. His revenge was not fiery spectacle, but careful orchestration of truth. The city had been wrong to condemn him, but now it would be wrong not to reckon with itself. And as night descended, he retreated further into shadows, knowing that the most dangerous moment for the powerful is when they cannot see the enemy. And now they could see nothing but themselves reflected in the mirror he had placed before them. Months had passed, and the city's pulse had changed. Once steady and confident, now irregular and cautious, he moved invisibly, a shadow among shadows, no longer seeking recognition, no longer seeking vindication, every act carefully measured to expose not just guilt, but the fragility of the structures that had condemned him. The officials whispered behind closed doors, unsure whom to trust. Every minor truth released sparked debates, investigations, accusations. The city itself became a tribunal, self-administered and unforgiving. He remembered the words of Sun Tzu: "Victorious warriors win first, and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first, and then seek to win," and recognized the patience in his own strategy. He had won the battlefield before anyone even realized it existed. Another thought surfaced from Eleanor Roosevelt: "Do what you feel in your heart to be right, for you'll be criticized anyway." And he understood that morality mattered little to those clinging to power. His role was not to be understood, only unavoidable. He continued planting traces, documents connecting officials, reports exposing corruption, subtle reminders of decisions long ignored. The people began to question not just leaders but the systems themselves. Even merchants and teachers felt the ripple of doubt. Alliances formed and collapsed daily. Whispers became rumors, rumors became pressure, and pressure forced action. He watched from rooftops as the city consumed itself with reflection and paranoia. He no longer sought applause, only inevitability. Consequence had become his instrument, and as night fell, he felt a strange calm, knowing that his revenge was no longer personal. It had become systemic, a quiet reckoning that no one could evade. The hero they betrayed had vanished, but the lesson he carved into the city's conscience would last far longer than memory. And in the darkness, he planned the next move, not to strike individuals, but to ensure the city could no longer ignore truth without cost. By now, the city had become a living map of suspicion, every corner, every office, every marketplace vibrating with uncertainty. He observed from the rooftops, invisible, yet intimately aware of every tremor his previous revelations had caused. The leaders moved like marionettes, unsure of which strings were real. Alliances formed in secret, then crumbled under the weight of whispered evidence. People began to second-guess everything. Their own neighbors, their own friends. His patience was his weapon, the slow erosion of confidence sharper than any sword. He recalled the words of Marcus Aurelius: "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And he understood that the real battlefield was perception, not action. Another line from Niccolò Machiavelli struck him: "Whosoever desires constant success must change his conduct with the times." And he smiled, for he had become the constant variable in their lives, invisible yet unyielding. He continued releasing truths in measured doses, exposing not just errors but patterns of complicity and cowardice. The city became self-policing, unsure of its own morality, unsure of whom to trust. Even the most confident figures hesitated before speaking, every whispered conversation a potential spark. Every glance a potential accusation. He did not act directly, but ensured that every move, every statement, every choice carried the weight of accountability. He watched as institutions that had once seemed permanent and untouchable began to fracture under their own contradictions. Citizens debated openly what had once been. Unquestioned, fear of exposure replaced fear of punishment. Justice had returned in an indirect, unavoidable form. He felt no malice, only the quiet satisfaction of inevitability. He had stopped being a hero or a villain. He was now the measure of consequence. And as dusk fell, he considered the next wave, knowing that each new revelation would not just punish the guilty, but force the indifferent to reckon with themselves. The city was finally learning, slowly and painfully, that truth has a cost and avoidance is no longer an option. The city had changed in ways no one could fully admit. Its pulse uneven, its leaders defensive, its people wary of both words and silence. He walked unnoticed through streets that had once shouted his name in blame and admiration. Now they whispered uncertainty, each face a reflection of doubt. He did not need to confront anyone directly. The city had become his instrument. Every action, every hesitation, every revelation orchestrated by his prior interventions. The officials trembled at their own decisions, fearful of being caught in the web he had spun. He remembered the words of Benjamin Franklin, "Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are." And he understood that the city's slow awakening was a form of justice. Another line surfaced from Sun Tzu, "Opportunities multiply as they are seized." And he saw how small truths, carefully timed, had grown into unstoppable momentum. Rumors now carried weight. Accusations became actions, alliances shifted unpredictably, and no one could predict the next step because he was no longer visible, yet omnipresent in consequence. The city began to police itself not from morality but fear, each citizen realizing that lies tolerated yesterday were now dangerous today. He prepared another subtle release of information, not destructive but revealing, connecting dots, making complicity unavoidable. No speeches, no confrontations, only clarity. He was no longer a hero seeking vindication nor a villain seeking chaos. He had become a force of reckoning. The betrayed had vanished, replaced by the architect of consequences. And as night fell, he watched the city hold its breath, knowing that his work was not vengeance in the old sense but a slow, precise re-education, shaping behavior, perceptions, and fear into understanding. And in that silence he felt the weight of inevitability, knowing the city would never be the same again. By now the city had entered a strange equilibrium, tense but functional. People moved cautiously, measured their words. Even casual conversations carried the weight of potential exposure. He moved like a shadow, never seen but always present in consequence. He had learned that the most effective revenge was invisible, systemic, unavoidable. Small truths released at the right moment could ripple outward, breaking trust where it once seemed unbreakable. He recalled the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, "Invisible threads are the strongest ties," and realized that every whisper, every revealed connection had bound the city tighter to the reckoning he orchestrated. Another thought surfaced from Machiavelli: "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." And he acknowledged its truth without embracing cruelty. He did not act out of anger, but precision, timing, inevitability. Officials now hesitated before giving orders. Citizens scrutinized each other. The streets hummed. With silent anxiety, he did not intervene directly, but every release of information, every uncovered lie, every exposed complicity ensured that consequences unfolded naturally. He observed, noted, waited, understanding that patience was more lethal than any blade. Even small acts of corruption now carried weight. As people questioned authority, questioned friends, questioned themselves, the city's structure creaked under the pressure. He no longer needed to prove innocence. The truth had become unstoppable. His plan was complete in its design, though endless in its unfolding. He had become not a man but an idea, an invisible law, shaping behavior without speech. And as night descended, he looked upon the city with cold clarity, knowing that the betrayed hero no longer existed, and the city's reckoning, slow and systemic, would continue long after he disappeared entirely from sight. The city had become a maze of caution, every word measured, every decision questioned, and he watched it all unfold like a patient conductor, orchestrating a symphony of consequences without ever appearing on stage. The officials moved nervously, afraid to act without verifying. Citizens whispered to one another, unsure whom to trust. Alliances crumbled quietly under the weight of evidence he had planted. He understood that true revenge did not require violence or spectacle, only inevitability. He remembered the words of Sun Tzu, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," and realized that the city was now at war with itself. Another thought surfaced from Niccolò Machiavelli. Men in general judge more from appearances than from reality. All men have eyes, but few have the gift of penetration, and he smiled at the irony. For the city had eyes, but had failed to see him until it was too late. Each small release of truth, each subtle exposure, had caused ripple effects that no one could control. Fear of accountability replaced fear of authority. People turned on one another, suspicious, uncertain, hesitant. Even the most confident officials second-guessed their own commands. The streets felt fragile, like glass underfoot, and he moved invisibly, knowing that the real power was not in confrontation but in shaping perception. The city had absorbed his lessons, painful and undeniable, and even without his presence, behavior had begun to align with consequence. He no longer thought in terms of hero or villain, only in terms of inevitable results. As night fell, he allowed himself a fleeting thought from Marcus Aurelius. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be 1 inch, yet he understood that in this case being good meant being deliberate, precise, unrelenting, and the city, slowly, painfully, was learning exactly what that meant. The city had changed completely, no longer the place that had cheered or condemned him. It was quieter, more cautious, yet alive with tension. Every citizen measured their words. Every official double-checked their actions. He walked through it unseen, unnecessary, for his influence had taken root far beyond his presence. Consequences now unfolded naturally. No spectacle required. Small truths continued to ripple outward, shaping behavior, decisions, and fear. He remembered the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how," and understood that his why had been transformed from survival to shaping inevitability. Another thought surfaced from Albert Camus. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer, and he recognized that the fire of betrayal had forged something durable, precise, unstoppable. The hero they had condemned no longer existed, replaced by an architect of reckoning whose lessons would continue without end. Trust had fractured, alliances dissolved, silence carried weight, and the city learned that actions have consequences even when accountability is invisible. He did not act for revenge in its old form, but for balance, for inevitability, for teaching that indifference and fear have prices. And as night fell over rooftops and empty squares, he disappeared completely, leaving only the echoes of decisions, the tremors of doubt, and the certainty that the city would never forget. That truth, even ignored, shapes everything. The betrayed hero was gone. The reckoning remained. And in that quiet he finally allowed himself peace, knowing that the lesson had been delivered, precise, patient, and irrevocable, a silent justice no one could escape. And somewhere in the shadows, he smiled, not for triumph, not for vengeance, but for the inevitability of truth itself.